Hey everybody, it's me, Angela Walters. Welcome to this week's live chat. If you're joining me live, thank you so much. As always, I'm here on a Thursday at 3 p.m. Central, where I go live to talk about quilting stuff and I answer your questions live. And as always, Jessica, the mysterious woman behind the curtain, is watching the chat. She's kicking out the spammers and writing down your questions. So if you have a question, you're watching it live, go ahead and type it out now. In the last week's live chat, we recapped the first week of the Free Motion Challenge video series. And this week, I'm recapping the second week of the video series. So any questions you have pertaining to that or anything in general, I like to answer those. I have great news though for those of you that are waiting ever so patiently for your panel orders. They are shipping. We finally got our shipment of fabric in, and we have been cutting and shipping like crazy. So look forward to those notifications coming through. So last week, if you remember, if you've watched the video that I put out, the tutorial, we saw the two basic shapes that make up the dot-to-dot challenge technique, or dot-to-dot technique. Just two basic shapes. In fact, I kind of joked that they seem so basic, you might be thinking like, why am I even learning this? But this week, we're starting to build off of those basic shapes. So we're going to start really kind of seeing the fun things that we can make with those designs and where to actually use them on our quilts. And before we get into the pictures and before I answer your questions, I just want to reiterate something I said in that video tutorial that came out on Tuesday. I don't want them to be overwhelming. I understand, especially if you're new to machine quilting, seeing all the variations might make you think, oh, I can't learn them all, so I'm just not even going to try. And that's not it at all. Instead, just think of it as like my persuasive argument to make you love this technique as much as I do. Try the variations you like, skip the ones you don't. Come up with your own variations. There's so many ways you can use this on your quilt. So please, please do not let it overwhelm you. That's not the point I'm trying to do at all. So I'm going to kind of recap a little bit of what we talked about in that video tutorial and show you some examples of these on actual quilts. I think it's so important to see how you can really use them on the quilt tops that you may or may not have laying around. And so when we build off of that diamond design, right, that first basic shape we learned, and it's a line that touches some corners of your block and doesn't touch others to kind of create a different shape on the inside. And so we took that idea and we created some different variations. And the first and easiest one is to fill in the middle of it with a different filler design. And here we can see I have a wishbone kind of shape, but that filler you're using can be anything that you want. It could be a swirl, it could be a meander, it could be pebbles, whatever you feel like quilting. And the reason I include it as a variation, especially when it might just seem kind of obvious, is that it does provide nice contrast between those straight lines and that curvy bit in the center. Another thing I don't think I really said in the video, this is a great option if you're struggling with those straight lines. You can have less straight lines in your design and use filler to fill in any of those spaces in the middle. It just gives you an opportunity to say, you know what, I'm done with this, I'm gonna fill in the space and move on. But the inverse is also true. Maybe you are fine quilting those straight-ish lines, but the free motion is what's giving you a hard time. It gives you a little defined area to fill it in and move on. So kind of a good way to transition into either one of those that you want to. In the video, I demonstrated in a different kind of shape, not our regular square, but it just shows you that with the design, you just pick some corners to touch and pick some not to touch. So experiment with that, kind of find what you like. And this is just an example of a different filler, serpentine lines. As I'm working through the panel and taking pictures for the class that we're doing, I like to show some different options. Again, it could be anything that you feel like quilting. Have fun with coming up with those different filler designs. But one thing that's a little different that you might not think about is you could echo or do diamond design on just one side of the block. So for instance, you don't have to do both those straight lines on both sides. You can do it on one side and then fill in the other half. You give a design that's kind of weighted to one side, but it really can create a cool twirling effect when used in multiple blocks. So in this example, I just did the diamond design on one part of the block and I used a feather in the rest of it. So again, you can really pick and choose, how much straight lines you want to put in there and what kind of filler you want to put in there as well. Again, I did the feather here just because I felt like doing that, but it can be any design. Now, when we talk about putting that filler in as a variation, sometimes I do it because I'm tired of quilting straight lines, but other times I do it to make a shape easier to fit in a design. So in this example, we see the plume feather, which is a beautiful, curvy, kind of pointy design, but it tends to work best in not narrow, but narrower shapes, more drawn out shapes. You can put it in a square, but it just gets kind of hard to stretch that fern all the way out to the side. So in this example, I did a little bit of that diamond design just to take that square shape and make it fit, or make it the space that would be better for that plume feather. So again, when you're looking at your quilts, ask yourself, what will make this easier for me, and how can I achieve that? So whether you're, coming up with different fillers or just using it as a way to make it convenient for you, it's really nice to do that. Now, when you're looking at your quilt, you can, do your diamond design or your straight lines on the outer sides of the block and then put your filler on the inside. Or you could switch it up and do your diamond design on the inside and the filler on the outside. This is something I would love to do, like right here, when I have multiple blocks next to each other, just to kind of give it, a little bit of a different look. Now, throughout this video series, and really in a lot of the videos that I have, I say a lot that people will notice a gap in the quilting before they notice an error. And this picture is a perfect example of that. In both of these sections, the unquilted area is what stands out, not so much the straight-ish line or the filler. So let that be kind of an encouragement, because when you're quilting and your face is 2 inches from that straight line, it can be very frustrating. But just know that when you step back, that unquilted area is what's really going to shine. Then we saw how to use that diamond design in triangles. Basically, we're just taking that square and chopping it in half. And this is how I use the design 90% of the time. I love it in triangles, in flying geese triangles, because there's not quite enough room. They're usually smaller triangles. There's not enough room for a feather. And when you're looking for the triangles on your quilt, you might be surprised the areas that will show up. So here we can see, this is a quilt I did for Tula. It has that star. And even though the pink is the background, I did the diamond design around the block, looking to the area around the block as my guide. It's an easy way to separate that block from the background, just add some pointy interest and make it look nice. So when you're looking for these areas to fill in, you don't look just at the blocks. Look in between them, look around them. You might be surprised in what you can see. And in this block, if you look in the corners, that's that square shape with the one-sided diamond design, right? Perfect example of where I would use just the half on there. So again, you can kind of play around with that. The reason I did that kind of diamond design around the block is there wasn't room to echo around the points. The way I quilted the top of that little potion bottle, or whatever you want to call it. So this allows me to have that echo look within the space that I have available. So use your imagination. You might be surprised on what shows up. And pick and choose where you put them, right? Here, another block, same quilt, different fabric, and I just did the triangles and not the corners. So why did I do it? Just for a slightly different look. I don't know. I felt like doing it. It looked like kind of fun. So again, look at your quilts and think, what can I do in there? What can I put in that area? Now, we kind of went from squares to triangles, and then we're kind of going back to bigger blocks. As you start using these designs in different areas, you're going to have to kind of talk to yourself, since you are the expert of your opinion, and see what feels comfortable for you. Sometimes putting that design, the regular diamond design, in bigger blocks means I'm quilting longer lines, which is fine. But if that isn't something I'm comfortable at, if I don't, want to do that, there's some other options for you. And this option right here is to take that space, divide it in two, and then quilt the diamond design in those triangles. So I call this zigzag because I'm just, alternating the direction of it. It looks kind of like a lightning bolt, kind of fun. But all I'm doing is just using the quilting to divide that block up and filling in the design. And as we work through the variations throughout this whole video series, you're going to see that again and again and again. But just a good example of, how you can use these in different areas. Now, this particular design, when I showed it in the video tutorial, I talked about stitching in the ditch, or on this, it was a fake ditch because it's a panel. But as you're working on your quilts, I like to stitch in the ditch, and I was able to use the stitching in that seam around the outside of the block to get from point to point. At any point, with any design, if you don't want to stitch in the ditch, you can just tie off, start a new line of quilting at the next spot. With all of these designs, I cannot say it enough, you can change up the way you quilt them to make them fit your preferences. Now, if you're like, Angela, I don't know what I prefer, well, just start quilting a couple times and you'll figure out what you do and don't like. So this particular design, again, is just that triangle shape, in a bigger block, switching directions. But when you're looking at a design, you can't just look at it by itself. You have to kind of see it within the context of the whole quilt. Because sometimes when you put the same design next to each other, it creates secondary patterns, and that was something I showed in the video tutorial. Just a real fun option for that kind of thing. When you're looking at your blocks, you're like, ooh, what kind of secondary designs can I come up with? Sometimes I plan that out ahead of time, and sometimes I'm pleasantly surprised by what happens. Now, speaking of breaking up blocks into smaller spaces, this was the Quattro design. So funny, I used to call it the 4x4, and then I realized, well, that's silly, there's only 2x2. There's not 16 in there. Anyway, when you're looking at your blocks, if it seems too big for the design, too long for you to quilt, you can break it up into smaller pieces. In this particular example, I just broke that block up into 4 squares. But I quilted that diamond design so that it rotated around that center point. The cool thing about that is I get a motif type look. I have more lines to the design, but they're not long. So you're gonna kind of have to weigh your preferences and see how you feel about that. But I love how it kind of draws your eye to the center of the block. Now, as we work through all these designs, where the lines go is where your eyes will go. So being aware of that will help you put these designs in blocks that you want to show off or blocks that you want to use to detract from something you might not like somewhere else. So I'm not going to put this design in a block that's my least favorite fabric or that is in the center of a block that I didn't do well piecing. So I'm going to be aware that where I put this is really going to draw attention. Now, we have a lot of lines coming to the center, especially in this example where I added echoing on the inside. Using a thread color that blends in or matches your quilt top will cover a multitude of quilting sins. So yeah, it is going to be thread heavy in the center, but that's how it's supposed to be. So just keep that in mind. Now, one thing I didn't get a chance to talk through in the video is this design starts in the center and ends in the center. And that's great, especially if it's the center of the quilt. I want to make sure I have that nailed down. But if I'm quilting a lot of blocks, I don't usually want to tie off and start a new line of quilting. A good thing to remember is this design starts and ends in the same place. So if I start in the corner, I can work my way to the center, do the other blocks, and then work my way out. You don't have to remember exactly how, but just know that you can quilt it so that you start from the corner and end on the corner. And that was an example that was in the expanded resource PDF that was for that week. So if you bought that, you can already see the step-by-step designs. And just like any of the designs, I can add more or less lines depending on how much I love the person I'm giving it to or how much of a time crunch I'm in. Just adding more will help you do that. All right, then we saw the double diamonds where we took the diamond design and overlapped it on top of each other. Super fun. I quilt it in one direction, travel along the edge to the next corner, and do it in the opposite direction. The reason I showed this is it's great for larger blocks, but also as a way to highlight the center. If I have a piece of fabric with a cool, motif in the center of that square, it's just a kind of a fun way to leave that center unquilted and kind of frame it and let me see it. I will say, and I did say this in the video, the hardest part about this design is ignoring the previously quilted diamond. So that's kind of fun because you're trying not to look at those lines. You're just kind of focusing on the one you're quilting. And I said in the video, but I do want to reiterate it, don't stress too much about making these perfect. Just get it close and move on. Remember, the unquilted area in the center is what's going to show up. This is also a great option if your lines aren't perfect because you can put another one on top of it. And with quilting, the more stuff you add around it, the less you see any individual line. So it's a great option for that. Depending on the block that you're quilting it in, you're going to get a different shape. So this is a diamond shaped block. And so you can see that one of the diamond designs is pretty long and stretched out. The other's kind of wide, but it's just a fun example of that effect there. And then, like I said, seeing a design within multiple blocks, creating that secondary pattern. In this star panel, we can see the green and the yellow, and it has those double diamonds and kind of how they connect and create a cool secondary design. So really fun option there. Now, I want to reiterate, again, not every variation is for every person. So I just kind of try to think through different variations that would help with different quilts, block types, and different preferences and skill levels. But if you're new to quilting, this probably shouldn't be the first design you try, but it's the procrastination. And I call it that because you put off finishing any of those diamonds until you finish it. But what's really cool is it creates a really neat effect and does, highlight the center of the block. This is going to be something I do in bigger blocks in focal parts of the quilt. It takes a little bit longer to develop, and it takes a second to wrap your mind around it. So watch the tutorial if you're not sure what I'm talking about, but it's pretty fun and it looks really cool on your quilts. Basically what I'm doing is I'm quilting consecutive diamond designs, but I'm just switching the corners that touch. And I talked through two options where you can tie off and start a new line of quilting with each one, or once you feel comfortable with it, how you can do it in one continuous motion, just depending on your preferences and how you like to work through it. But once you get the hang of it, how it goes together, it's really cool and interesting, but so easy to quilt. So you should definitely try that if you're not sure. And then if you need an extra little challenge, you're like, it's too easy for me, you can put some filler on the inside of that block. So you can see some pebbles, again, kind of in the inside. I love it in this star because you kind of have that pop of texture and it looks so cool. So again, is it for every quilter? No. Is it for the newer quilter? It's not any more difficult than any of the other designs. It just takes a second to wrap your mind on where you're going. So at any point with any of the designs, just stop, take your time, and think through it. Some other examples that I found, this is that double diamond design. When you're building off of your designs, keep adding to it, right? Keep going, and sometimes you'll be pleasantly surprised. This particular example I didn't show in the video because it's pretty, step heavy, but I have two double diamonds, and the points where those lines cross then became points that I connected to create a square and fill it in. So as you're working through it, if you think like, ooh, what if I did this? Or what if I did that? You might be pleasantly surprised on the variations that come up. If you quilt something different and you don't like it, then just don't quilt it anymore. But if you quilt something and you love it, well, then now you have a new design and a new way to make this design even more versatile and, apply it to more quilt blocks. So you can jump off it and build off it in a lot of different ways. And I didn't really get a chance to talk about irregular areas. We're going to see that probably in week 4, or definitely in week 4. We're going to talk about using that dot design in shapes that aren't your square, triangle, diamond shapes. And this particular block has those, polygon shapes. That's not a polygon, whatever you call it, trapezoid. But you can see how I use the quilting in there to kind of create that triangle I want to fill in and then fill it in. So you can use it design in so many different ways. I had to be careful because I can start sounding like an infomercial, but wait, there's more for the same price. It was very difficult to kind of rein myself in with the designs. In fact, one of the ones I didn't show, but is in the expanded resource PDF, is X marks the dot. I tell you what, I'm so bad at coming up with names, but I did really try to make them kind of clever here. This example, I'm doing the same thing that we saw with some of the other ones. I'm using the quilting to break up the space into 4 triangles, and then I'm quilting the diamond design and putting a filler. The difference here is it's just creating a motif and really kind of drawing your eye to the center. Now, for a lot of these designs, especially in the videos that you see me quilt through, it's a solid piece of fabric so that you can see what I'm doing. But just know you can use these in pieced blocks as well. So, start looking at those designs and see what kind of fun stuff you can come up with. Again, as I'm showing the variations, I'm not trying to make it overwhelming or intimidating, but I'm just trying to show you how you can build off those basic shapes and use it in a lot of different ways. So hopefully you found some good inspiration there for the quilts that you have laying around. Now, I think there's questions. I see Jessica writing, furiously, but next Tuesday, I will be releasing the video for Starburst. So the second design we learned, and we'll be seeing variations with that. And of course, I'll be back next Thursday at 3 p.m. Central with a live chat to recap that. So be sure to check that out. And if you subscribe to my YouTube channel, you'll be notified when those come out. How do I get rid of starts and stops nests? Okay, I'm gonna start over. How do I get rid of start and stop nests on the back of my long arm? This is gonna be the same for a sewing machine or a long arm. If I just start quilting in place, that bobbin thread's gonna make kind of a nest. That's such a pretty word for it. It's a glob until it, catches and then moves on. So pulling your bobbin thread up to the top is going to help you. And then I like to take a few stitches right in place, and that kind of helps prevent that nest from showing. I did say last week's live chat that I would make a little video showing you how I tie on and tie off. I will try to do that for next week's video. Again, we've been filling orders like crazy. So with glide thread, is an 80 needle the best option? I think so, 80 or 90. If you have 90, it's fine. And this is talking about sewing machines, but 80 is great too. You know that the needle's not the right size if you're getting shredding at the needle. So, but yeah, that's a great option. Using a ruler, many of the stops seem to jump despite keeping the needle down. Any tips? Yes. So I've noticed myself doing this when I'm quilting on a sewing machine and I stop, the needle goes down, I reposition, and then I start quilting. Well, if there's any pull on that quilt at all, if it's hanging, when the needle comes up, that fabric is going to slip, it's going to move in the time it takes for that needle to come down, and you get a little jagged stitch there. So make sure before you resume that you don't have any of the, it's not hanging down or pulling against it. I hope that makes sense. On a long arm, it could just be maybe you have the stitch regulator on and you have to give it a little bit of a nudge to take that next stitch. So if that's the case, maybe checking your stitches per inch, having more stitches per inch will mean it has to travel not quite as far to make the stitch. So hopefully that helps. Newbie here. When using slim, I'm struggling to have the centers meet at the same spot. They're also 1/4 inch off. What register mark should I be focusing on when lining up the dots? That is the fun part about quilting with rulers, whether it's on a sewing machine or a long arm. The space between the needle and the edge of the foot is about 1/4 inch. So if you put that needle if you put the ruler right on the dot you want it to end up at, you're going to end up 1/4 inch away. So what I do is I kind of eyeball it, I kind of back it off 1/4 inch so that I can get to that spot. Now, if it doesn't hit those dots perfectly, it's okay. Just get it close and move on. I promise it's going to work itself out. Another thing you can do is I have a whole video series on machine quilting with rulers. So it's called Machine Quilting with Rulers Free Motion Challenge. You can check out my YouTube channel or my website, and I talk through the specifics of using that. Getting good at eyeballing that 1/4 inch will come with practice for sure. I'm getting ready to quilt a hexagon quilt. Is it okay to quilt each one differently? Absolutely. Yeah, I think you should. Sometimes I'm asked, can you use too many designs on a quilt? And I think you probably could. I've just never seen it happen. So yeah, I love doing that. And sometimes I'll give myself a challenge like, ooh, how many different ways can I quilt these blocks? And when you're done, you take pictures of the ones you like, and now you have, some inspiration for the next quilt. So hopefully that helps. Do I always outline the shapes? So do I always stitch in the ditch around the blocks or on the panel, the fake blocks? I do, because I like to do it. I think stitching in the ditch is like getting your eyebrows waxed. Not because it's painful, but because it just makes everything look better, but you're not sure why. So I do. I love stitching in the ditch, but it's not required. It's not necessary. But we've seen in this last video that I like to use stitching in the ditch to not only, help define that area, but also to move me around the block. I'm also not worried if part of the block isn't stitched in the ditch and the rest is. So now I gotta pause and say, hey, don't do what I say and expect to win ribbons at a quilt show. That's not what this is about. But yeah, if you're quilting your own quilts that you want to use and love and all that fun stuff, then yeah, stitch around the outside. You don't like doing it, then don't do it. So it's totally fine either way. Would I recommend outlining in black or the other colors? So for those of you that are quilting along on the panel, no, I would outline the blocks in the thread color I'm using in the block. I would just cheat it ever so slightly towards the non-black side. But again, if you do travel over in the black on accident, a black fabric marker will color in those stitches and help hide it. If I choose not to tie off and stitch in the ditch, can I go over the line on top of the already stitched lines? How many is too many times? So this is where I get to say, it depends. It depends on what you prefer. I think it's totally fine to stitch over a previously quilted line, right? So if I'm traveling around the edge of the block and I have to hit this side twice, I'm okay with that. But for some reason in my head, 3 is too many. That's just me. So it's totally fine. And it depends on your preferences. It depends on, the thread you're using. If I'm using a really thick thread that contrasts, I might not travel on top. It's totally fine. There's no right or wrong when it comes to machine quilting. And I'm so happy to share my opinion, but you have to remember it's just my opinion. So as you're quilting, if you're thinking, well, there's nothing wrong with 3 times, perfect. If you're like, I can't go over it twice, then don't, right? I feel like we have enough stuff to worry about in life. Let's not worry about the stitching in the ditch. Let's just do what we want and move on. So hopefully that helps. So if you're quilting along with the challenge, I hope that you are having fun with the variations. I hope that you'll post pictures of what you're doing on the Facebook group, because it's so fun to see the different variations you're coming up with. And just know that as you're working through them, again, you can change them, you can change how you quilt them, you can do whatever you like, whatever you will do to make you comfortable with the designs. So looking forward to next week, because again, we're going to go into the Starburst design. We're going to see some different variations, and then I'll be back for the live chat for that. Now, I have seen it's super cold over most of the U.S., so everybody stay warm. This is prime quilting time, and I will be back next week. Until then, everybody stay warm and happy quilting.